Hello, welcome. Today I'd like to talk about the subject of wokeism, or wokeness as it is sometimes referred to, how I see it's currently affecting us all, as well as some suggestions as to the most helpful way to respond to it. A brief definition of wokeism can be said to refer to a state of being awake, aware, and concerned about social injustice and discrimination. It has many of the characteristics of an ideology and a doctrine whose goal is ostensibly to raise society's consciousness about certain issues and groups. It covers topics of racism, inequality and gender issues, and is associated with current social aspects including what is called self-identification, cancel culture, unconscious racial bias, hate speech, and a person feeling hurt and offended and not feeling safe. In many ways you could describe it as a societal phenomenon that for many has seemed to arrive quite recently and suddenly. Yet it is actually reported that wokeism has gradually been slowly developing from back in the 1970s primarily, but not exclusively, within higher education institutions in the USA. Nevertheless, however well-meaning, worthy and altruistic parts of its underlying message and aim may appear to be, I personally have considerable doubts about the overall methods and behaviour by which many groups that come under the umbrella of wokeism and their proponents are going about achieving those aims. And I don't see how ultimately they can work either to their own benefit, those they're advocating for, or those they wish to persuade. So, why do I say this? Well, for two reasons that are different but equally important. Firstly, through the eyes of a relationship counsellor, which I am, it seems to me that the woke movement are trying to use an ideology on behalf of what is actually an unmet, powerful and vulnerable emotional and relational need. Let me say that again. With the eyes of a relationship counsellor, it seems to me that the woke movement are trying to use an ideology on behalf of what is actually an unmet, powerful and vulnerable emotional and relational need. This need is not being directly expressed by its proponents, and neither do they seem to be consciously aware of it, but I would say are inadvertently using the ideology as a surrogate on its behalf. This cannot work because you're not saying what you really want. And so in a sense it can be described as communicating at the wrong level and using the wrong vehicle to get its need met. Perhaps not unlike feeling thirsty and wanting a drink of water, but opt instead for eating a liquidy foodstuff in the attempt to slake your thirst. To my eyes and ears, if this need had a voice, it would say something like, I want you to show more love, care and consideration towards me and those individuals or groups that matter to me and I am advocating for. However, nobody says that directly. This all reminds me of an amusing anecdote from the late psychologist and international mediator Marshall Rosenberg and his book Nonviolent Communication, A Language for Life, that nicely illustrates this point. He tells of a man being on all fours under a street lamp, searching for something. A policeman passing by asked what he was doing. Looking for my car keys, replied the man, who appeared slightly drunk. Did you drop them here? Inquired the officer. No, answered the man, I dropped them in the alley. Seeing the policeman's baffled expression, the man hastened to explain, but the light's much better here. The second important reason why I cannot see how wokeism can work is because of its overall style and manner. It seems to me that it imposes itself on people and society in an often insistent and entitled manner which, unfortunately at times in its extremes, can become demanding, intimidatory, coercive and bullying rather than persuading people in a way that leaves them free to make up their own minds. This happens in a number of differing ways that are both direct and indirect. However, forcing others to do what you want cannot be a healthy and holistic basis and means for getting your needs met, however deserving you or others feel your cause to be. For that is directly at odds with both a number of founding principles and values of human behaviour, democracy, and most importantly, not to forget, love. Because if your own actions are not coming from love, and there is a glaring and obvious dissonance between what you want and how you are acting and behaving yourself, thus diminishing your chances of getting it. When an ideology demonstrates a disregard for some of these basic personal principles and values of caring, human relationship and interaction, then it becomes the distraction and the problem itself rather than the remedy. So let's start by looking in more detail at the main vehicle that is being used to promote the ideology of wokeism. It can essentially be described as a conceptual belief system with moralistic overtones and behaviours. These combine to steer individuals and society towards doing what it wants. A key part of the potent effect of the moralistic overtones is the implicit message of the need to be a worthy, caring and good person, and that the opposite is true if you don't go along with what it or what its proponents want. This therefore acts as an invisible control that gets people to comply in order to feel included, avoid disapproval, and stay safe. This same inhibitor also prevents more people pushing back and calling out aspects of woke ideology and behaviours that transgress their own or normal social standards of care in society. This aspect is certainly reflected in what is called cancel culture. Cancel culture refers to where businesses and institutions have easily caved in to calls to sack employees or end associations with individuals from what is often a small but vociferous group on social media that are noisy and subjectively accuse these individuals of inappropriate views and behaviour. This capitulation of businesses would appear to happen directly as a result of the fear of what might be described as a more modern-day version of 3 of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse: being excluded, being shamed, or losing income. These are the inner psychological enforcers and henchmen that invisibly operate to get people to do what these activists want. It seems sad, disturbing and worrying that many of these institutions do not more readily resist calls to drop these individuals in particular when there is no obvious case proven, but is simply down to somebody's individual opinion. What about all the people who do not see it like them, which in some cases may be many and a lot more in number? One of the areas where wokeism and its proponents have touched society in arguably what could be called a lighter and more constructive way is in educational courses on unconscious racial bias, including topics associated with white privilege and white fragility. Many businesses and institutions in society have required their employees and associates to attend in-house courses to learn more about these subjects. Indeed, racial justice, equality, respect and compassionate behaviour towards everybody are not just vital goals, but ones which we would all typically agree with, and that we need to truly embody as a society. Education can be a significant part of that, but only when the educational information is such that participants feel free to make up their own minds without experiencing a preconceived bias to adopt the truth or the correct way of thinking about the course material by those putting it on. Because otherwise, unfortunately, it can get too close to coming across as a form of propaganda that carries an insinuated thin vein of coercion that the participant must adopt in order to be a worthy person, or in the case of an employee, perhaps feel secure about their continuing future work prospects. If change tries to happen this way, in my view, it never truly works because there is always a sense of unconscious or conscious resentment and fear at being made to do something that doesn't feel voluntary. This goes underground in our psychology and will eventually, sooner or later, come out in some negative way in society that needs to be readdressed. As an antidote to the possibility of this happening, it's necessary for participants to perceive that they have the freedom to question and are not being forced to agree. Additionally, they are directly encouraged to share how they emotionally and relationally feel in relation to the information provided, including all positive and negative feelings. This combination of information and authentic emotional engagement with it can then facilitate and lead to the possibility of truly encouraging connection for all. Before I turn to looking at responses and solutions to wokeism, I think it's helpful for us to look more closely at how one of its chief characteristics directly stands at odds with its counterpart in society. Across the entirety of the subjects that encompass the woke movement represented by their proponents and activists, there is a very considerable emphasis placed on the subjective experience of that individual. While in key areas of democratic society, it is objectivity that is a foundational value and principle that currently exists and is aimed for. Therefore, these two value systems are directly clashing in a number of ways. Many in the woke movement, particularly in its more passionate advocates, indicate that if they individually subjectively feel things are a certain way, then that in and of itself is sufficient basis for it to actually be true. Therefore, if you say something is hate speech, you self-identify a certain way, say as an animal, you are hurt or offended by someone's actions or views, or you say you do not feel safe as a result of this, then voila, ipso facto, it must be true. This approach actually goes against all prior established measures that society has previously used to assess a claim. In society, the measure applied is not that you don't care about people's well-being or listen out for cases of abuse, but rather, to the best of your ability, you prioritize and approach it by examining if their claim is substantiated and therefore objectively true. This is a founding principle of democracy, but most importantly, one that safeguards and maintains the overall cohesion of society and our collective freedom to speak. If you change that criteria and go ahead on the basis that truth consists of an individual subjectively deciding what it is through how they feel or see it in that moment, then it seems to me that we're opening a very large can of worms and going to quickly slide into a dystopian madness. When is a door not a door? When it's ajar. Democratic society has always previously and currently still operates on a different basis, where what is true is based on data and evidence rather than somebody's personal opinion or viewpoint, however strong that individual's conviction may be. This is also the basis for the law in democracies. A vital element for the mental health of individuals and the stability of society also rests upon us all having sufficient agreement as to what the objects in the world around us are. This includes the name we have for those objects, and also demonstrating that we agree with and are following the underlying key ethical values and principles that operate to uphold freedom and democracy. When this happens, it provides a calming, stable, reassuring, and very necessary experience for our individual and collective psyche, and as a result, allows society to function relatively smoothly. It also allows and accommodates individual difference, as long as that difference does not act in such a way to undermine and completely overwhelm the host. Unfortunately, it seems to me that wokeism and the woke movement overall do challenge these precepts in both lesser and more dramatic ways. In the lesser ways, it has a general air of being right, entitled, and insistent on getting its own way. And in the more extreme and dramatic responses of wokeism and the woke movement, we see an intensification of a demand that subjective experience is definitely the right measure of reality or truth in any moment, whilst objective data is both passé, irrelevant, obsolete, and in many instances not considered worthy of even recognizing and engaging with. If not even more concerning is the more dramatic personal behaviour of some within the woke movement, which not only lacks compassion, care and consideration for others, but as I have earlier described, can be intimidatory, demanding, coercive, and on occasions even bullying in style. Surely this cannot be right, whatever the merits of the subjective matter may be. So how do we think of and best respond to wokeism? If unchecked, I don't think it's too extreme to say that we're dealing with something that does directly threaten democracy and a number of our most precious institutions and fundamental ethical principles, including free speech and caring behaviour towards each other. As I've pointed out, I do not think that the woke movement overall sufficiently demonstrates that its actions and behaviour are truly coming from love. And I believe that ultimately it is a demonstrable lack of this quality that tells us where it is coming from and why and how we should assess it. James Lindsay, a commentator and critical theory analyst, sees critical theory as a cult and describes this as a moment in time where wokeism is the vehicle right now that's attempting to put the West through its own cultural revolution, very much like China got put through in the 1960s by the Chinese dictator Mao Zedong. As Mao's cultural revolution did then, now it radicalizes young people in schools who come out on behalf of this ideology and gets them to try and destroy and separate themselves from the old culture so that the new generation coming up will have a new culture. I'll put 2 links in the video information to James Lindsay talking about this, and irrespective of its source and its intention, then how best do we all respond to it? For me, this is attempted in 3 principal ways. 1, it has to include all of us being clear, first and foremost, about the fundamental values and principles of democracy and love that we wish to live our lives by, and for society and our institutions to reflect on our behalf. That it's helpful to state these clearly, directly, and uncompromisingly, but respectfully and compassionately to those fellow human beings we are in conversation with who are representing their needs in others or different ways to our own. Therefore, it also is useful to recognize when it is not helpful in getting caught in narratives and conversations that become about who's right. This happens when we get stuck in trading conceptual views, points and opinions as a means of advocating and championing our case. When we do this, I think this very much plays to the strengths of those who are promoting a woke viewpoint. While I agree much of the time this is very difficult to avoid, it tends to capture the conversation in areas that are unproductive to creating connection. So if we want to try at having a more compassionate and productive conversation with those who we may disagree with, then we also need to engage in the act of what is our second way of responding, which is called reframing. Reframing literally refers to putting a picture in a different picture frame, thus allowing the possibility of a different perception and experience of it for the viewer. In conversation, reframing refers to creating a different understanding and experience of what is meant, and therefore leads to the possibility of a different outcome. This is achieved through the style of what is said. For example, we might use more open-ended and information-gathering questions to individuals with the purpose of inviting and requesting conversation that is both meaningful to them and us. A couple of examples might be, "I can hear this is important to you. Would you be willing to tell me more?" And, "When I say that, please could you tell me what it is that you hear me saying?" This can result in much more immediate productive conversations and interactions, and steers away from more conflictual, binary and polarized discourse. Our third option of response is something I mentioned right at the start of this video. As a relationship counselor, I hear that wokeism and the woke movement undeniably have emotional and relational needs that underpin their ideology, narratives, and actions. In my view, encouraging accessing and sharing emotional and relational experience can be arguably our most powerful tool in successfully reframing and have a different type of conversation with those in the woke movement. And this, of course, is very, very difficult, for all of us, including myself, are so used to rationally explaining our viewpoint and experience, and we can kind of get frightened and angry and lost in the protection of our opinions and being right. What does the accessing and sharing of emotional and relational experience sound like? Can you tell me more, please, about the emotions you have in relation to what that person said on Twitter? When you perceive that society is not listening to and considering your needs, how does that affect your sense of relationship with them? How does it leave you feeling emotionally? I would like to find out more about and discuss our joint emotional and relational needs together. Would you be willing for us to do that? While these questions might sound unusual or strange, their style is intention, and intention is what I'm referring to when I talk about reframing the narrative and conversation to try to access the emotional and relational needs underneath. A lot of the time you have to hang in there with somebody, as they will tend to avoid answering those questions initially, particularly if they're not used to speaking about their emotions, or they don't trust you yet. It can help to acknowledge what they're saying, which doesn't mean agreeing with it, and then go back and see if you can ask the same or a similar question a second time, and perhaps get a different answer. If people trust your attention, then they're more likely to allow themselves eventually to respond and start talking more about their feelings. This also helps if we can risk revealing vulnerability in ourselves. For example, when you tell me I'm a this or I'm doing that, I notice that I feel scared underneath and feel like I'm inadequate, but want to protect myself by getting angry with you and defending myself. What's that like to hear when I say that to you? These give a few examples of how it might be helpful to communicate with each other to contribute to the possibility of getting a different result. But it is something that is not natural and normal for any of us to do, and so, as I've already said, is definitely not easy. So in summarizing the response to the specific subject of wokeism, I think standing firm but being respectful about our values and learning how to redirect the conversation to be one that encourages and invites emotional and relational connection with others are our two most powerful tools. I'll leave you with a philosophical reflection and viewpoint. At a meta level, at a kind of larger level, it may be that part of the reason why wokeism is happening right now in this rather awkward and challenging form is in one way to act as a spur and a trigger for our whole species. In a sense, it is a message from the species to the species, both to reflect individually and collectively the need historically in the past and in our future for more consideration, care and compassion by human beings in our interactions and conversations with each other, as well as indicating a need in the here and now for finding new ways of verbally communicating compassionately with each other. And in doing so, in a sense, being forced to remake a direct statement and reminder to each other in the here and now about what is most precious in life, living, and our society. And even though it's uncomfortable, for what is happening right now to act both as a statement and a doorway to a brighter future together. Thank you for listening. The material in my podcasts includes educational information about relationships and verbal communication, the societal values associated with maintaining democracy, and talking about current issues that are indeed affecting that democracy. In addition, I'm interested in looking at what can help our species move from being a young, violent, and rapidly technologically advancing one to one that can truly call itself highly evolved. I'm also available should you be interested in contacting me for an interview. And if you like the content or find it thought-provoking, do please let others know, as well as hit the subscribe button to be alerted to new videos. See you soon.